Hello everyone, welcome to today's story. A young woman named Diep, kidnapped and abandoned deep in the forest, didn't wait to be rescued. She stood up on her own, carrying pain and quiet determination, walking over 150 kilometers just to return to the man she loved, James. But what no one expected was that James had never stopped looking for her. Will fate allow them to reunite? Or will silence, distance, and old wounds keep them apart forever? Before we begin, if you believe in a kind of love that doesn't need promises, just a steady gaze and unwavering patience, then subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss any heartfelt stories like this one. Now, let's begin. The night had nearly passed, but the sky still wore the shade of sorrow, a dull, bruised gray that clung to the horizon. Diep's footsteps dragged, uneven, as if each one was borrowed from a strength she no longer had. Her shirt was torn at the shoulder, mud dried stiff on the hem of her jeans. Her breath came in shallow bursts, lips cracked by wind and thirst. Ahead, scattered across the distant hills, faint lights blinked like stars fallen to earth. Perhaps a small town, a place with water, a place where someone might say her name with kindness. She pressed forward. Every step burned. Her vision dimmed, her ribs ached. Then her body gave in. Her legs folded without warning, and she collapsed by the side of the dirt road. Her bag tumbled from her shoulder. A pack of crackers spilled out. Her fingers grazed the grass, then curled into fists against the earth. For a long moment she didn't move. Her chest barely rose. The wind whispered through brittle weeds. A bird called out once, then silence returned. Even the road seemed to pause. A motorbike passed, its engine hummed and faded. Her lips parted. She barely managed to whisper, "James." Just as the sun stretched its first golden fingers across the road, a shadow moved. Wheels creaked, footsteps shuffled. Someone was coming. A stranger. A choice. And in that fragile border between unconsciousness and waking, she felt it. A hand, warm against her forehead. Sometimes you fall not to give up, but so that someone finally finds you. The man was old, older than time, it seemed. His shirt hung loose, faded from sun and memory. A straw hat shadowed his face as he leaned over Diep. His cart creaked behind him, filled with collected bottles and scrap. A scavenger, a ghost of the roadside. He pressed 2 fingers to her wrist, still warm, breathing faint. The old man didn't speak. He just moved, carefully, reverently. From his cart he pulled a small cloth and dipped it into a bottle of water. With a gentleness only loneliness can teach, he wiped the dust from her face. Diep stirred. Her eyes opened briefly, clouded and slow. The blur of his figure made her flinch. "Rest," he whispered, voice like gravel on dry leaves. "You're safe." In the rising dawn, he lifted her, slow but steady, and placed her on a tarp in his cart. She didn't protest. Her body had surrendered, but her heart still held something. A name, a direction. "James," she murmured again, almost inaudible. The old man glanced back as he pushed the cart toward town. "Someone waiting for you?" She blinked, eyes glassy. A tear slid sideways into her hair. "I hope he waits right," the man muttered, more to the morning than to her. Not every man knows how. As the road stretched ahead, the old cart rolled over rocks and ruts, but steady. The girl inside barely moved, but in her sleep, her lips curved into the shadow of a smile. Because even strangers can carry you closer to home. James sat on the front steps of an old station house at the edge of the province, the same map unfolded across his knees, creased from being studied, rained on, studied again. His eyes were fixed on the red circle he'd drawn days ago, but his thoughts had drifted far beyond it. The search teams had called it off. 7 days. No trace. The forest had given nothing back, but he couldn't let go. Beside him, a notebook sat open. Inside, a letter, written but never sent. Not to Diep, to himself. To the version of him that hadn't known love could ache like this. If she's out there, he wrote, she remembers. Maybe not me, but the way I waited, the way I still do. A breeze caught the corner of the page, fluttered it like a bird testing flight. James pressed it down gently. The silence around him wasn't empty, it was waiting. A kind of echo. Behind him, a young officer approached, hesitant. "Sir, we've checked the route down the old highway. There's a report from a villager. A girl collapsed near Route 6. Matched your description." James stood before the words finished, the notebook closed, the map folded. Hope doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just shifts the wind. He didn't smile, but in his eyes something cracked open, like light through cloud. "She's walking back," he said softly, more to himself than anyone. "She's still walking." And without waiting for permission, he ran. Because some hearts don't rest. Not until they find their way back to the one still whispering their name. The cart stopped at the edge of a village, a scatter of rooftops nestled beside a sleepy river. Deep stirred as children's laughter echoed in the distance, carried by the wind like a half-remembered lullaby. Her body ached, but something deeper nudged her awake. The old man was gone. She sat up slowly, blinking against the morning light. A small bottle of water sat beside her, and a torn piece of paper weighed down by a stone. 3 words, scrawled in careful strokes. "You're almost home." She stared at them, then folded the paper into her pocket. Her legs trembled as she stood, but she didn't fall. She looked ahead, across the bridge, toward the road stretching like a thin line toward something bigger than any map. Each step was pain. But she had learned pain was a compass too. It pointed to what mattered most. Behind her, in the dust, tire tracks curved from the east. James. She didn't know he was just minutes behind. She didn't know his car had followed a villager's vague directions, heart pounding like a second engine. That he had passed the forest edge and now searched every path with eyes that refused to lose hope again. In another world, they might have met at that bridge. But real love doesn't always follow the shortest road. Sometimes it delays, pauses, waits for the right breath and time. As she crossed into the village, barefoot and blinking, a shopkeeper gasped, "Girl, you walked from the forest? Alone?" Diep looked back, dusty, scraped, but unbroken. "Yes," she whispered. But not without someone waiting. James parked his car by the roadside, dust swirling around the tires like ghosts he couldn't shake. He stepped out slowly, scanning the village with the tension of a man chasing a name through silence. Each face that passed made his heart jump, then fall again. Still, he kept moving. At the tea stall, a boy with a slingshot pointed toward the small bridge. "A girl crossed here this morning. Looked like she'd wrestled with a mountain." James didn't smile, but he breathed. For the first time in days, the air didn't feel like glass in his throat. He walked faster. At the end of the bridge, he paused. A piece of cloth fluttered from the railing. Familiar. The hem of Diep's scarf, caught on a nail. He reached for it, hands trembling, not with fear but recognition. She had passed here. In the still air, memories pressed against him. Her voice laughing over coffee, her hands brushing crumbs from his shoulder, her eyes searching his face as if memorizing it for a time like this. He clutched the scarf. Behind him, a motorbike approached. An old man nodded as he passed. James whispered, almost to the trees, "Don't let me be too late." He didn't know how close he was, that she had asked for him just one village away, that her breath still carried his name like prayer. But sometimes, even one village feels like a continent when you've been waiting for someone who's already begun to return. And the scarf in his hands. It no longer smelled of perfume. It smelled of journey, of dust, of Diep. The clouds gathered above like a quiet threat. Diep sat on the steps of a roadside shrine, her body curled, arms around her knees. Her lips were chapped, her eyes half closed, but she watched the sky with a kind of peace, like someone who had made it just far enough. Around her, the village stirred in slow rhythm, vendors calling, a bell tolling from a bicycle, the distant sound of chickens. But no one knew who she was or how far she'd come, and maybe that anonymity felt safer for now. A child offered her a plum. She smiled, nodded thanks, but didn't eat it. She was waiting for her breath to catch up, for the earth to stop spinning so fast. Down the road, a figure appeared. She didn't recognize him at first. His shirt was wrinkled, his steps uneven. A man searching without knowing what he'd find. James. He saw her. He didn't call out, didn't run, he just walked, as if afraid she might vanish if he moved too quickly. Diep rose slowly. Their eyes met across the distance. In that instant, the wind fell away. The noises of the village faded. The world became just one road, two people, and everything unsaid between them. She opened her mouth, but no words came. He shook his head gently. "You don't have to explain." And then, only then, did the rain begin to fall, soft, forgiving, the kind that doesn't chill, only cleanses. She stepped forward, so did he, and the silence between them broke, not with thunder, but with breath. They had found each other again. Not by fate, by choice. The house was quiet that night. Not the silence of emptiness, but the kind that settles between two people who have crossed oceans of doubt to sit side by side again. Diep sat on the couch, wrapped in a wool blanket, her wet hair leaving dark marks on the fabric. James brewed tea in the kitchen, movements careful, deliberate. Not out of habit, but reverence. As if he were making tea for a ghost he didn't dare believe had truly returned. She spoke first. "Do you think we can be the same again?" James didn't turn. He stirred the tea, sugar, then silence, then finally, "I hope not." Diep looked up. Why? Because the same broke us once. Maybe what we become next will be braver. She closed her eyes. Let that truth settle. In the other room, the twins slept soundly. The sound of their soft breathing reminded her that love wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was two tiny chests rising in unison. James handed her a cup, sat beside her. Not touching, just present. "Will you stay?" he asked, eyes not demanding, only hoping. Diep looked down at the tea. Steam rising like a quiet promise. "I walked 150 kilometers, she whispered. "I think I've already answered." James laughed softly. No victory, just gratitude. They didn't kiss, they didn't cry. They just sat there, tea in hand, the sound of rain tapping the windows. Two people, no longer divided by distance, but learning how to navigate the space between hurt and healing. And in that stillness, where no words were needed, something beautiful happened. They began again. After escaping a kidnapping orchestrated by John, Diep embarked on a grueling journey, walking over 150 kilometers through forests and villages to return to James, the man who had never stopped waiting for her. Along the way, she faced hunger, exhaustion, and isolation, yet never gave up. Meanwhile, James searched relentlessly, following faint traces with fading hope. They narrowly missed each other multiple times, as fate quietly tested the strength of their connection. In the end, under a gentle rain and without dramatic declarations, they found each other again. Not with grand gestures, but with stillness, presence, and a love that spoke louder in silence. Their reunion wasn't about returning to what once was, but about choosing to begin again, with courage, tenderness, and the quiet power of unwavering belief.